From Built It Productions, it's The Great Creators. Conversations about creativity with some of the most celebrated actors, musicians, and performers of our time. I'm Guy Raz, and on the show today, singer-songwriter Phil Elverum of The Microphones and Mount Eerie.
Part of my creative process is the freedom of knowing that it's like not going to be perfect, and that in fact it's probably the imperfections that makes it more interesting.
Since starting out in Anacortes, Washington, Phil Elverum has become an icon of independent music in the Pacific Northwest, first as The Microphones and then as Mount Eerie. In 2001, Pitchfork named his record The Glow Part 2 the best album of the year. Phil has recorded more than 40 albums and documented decades of his life in song, even the most tragic moments. When Phil's wife, Genevieve, passed away from cancer in 2016, he didn't know if he'd have it in him to make music again. But he did. In 2017, he released A Crow Looked at Me, an album about her death. It ended up on several Best of the Decade lists, and Pop Matters called it one of the most remarkable folk albums ever produced. So in this episode, you'll hear about Phil's musical beginnings playing the tuba, the revelation that opened up a new way of writing lyrics, and the 40-minute song that tells his life story. And by the way, Phil brought his guitar to the interview, so stick around and you'll get to hear him play a bit. That's all coming up after the break. Phil Elverum was born in Anacortes, Washington, a small town just about 90 minutes north of Seattle. His family didn't have running water or electricity until he was 7 years old. And before he started pursuing music, Phil dreamt of becoming a filmmaker.
Music didn't really have like a serious or professional standing in my family, but it was just kind of always present. My dad and his friends, my great-grandma, it was her life. She was the music teacher for all the children in Anacortes before my time, like in the 50s, but that was sort of her, even when she was an old lady, when I was a baby. So yeah, music was present and sort of unemphasized. It was available. It never seemed like a strange thing to pursue.
What do you remember hearing when you were a little kid, when you were the age of your daughter now? What was playing in your house?
My dad would probably have his friends over once a week to play Bob Dylan songs, Neil Young songs, American Songbook, classic.
Yeah. Songs
that are meant to be learned and played. Harmonies. He still does that. He still gets together with his friends and plays music. I remember the sound of my dad's voice as I'm falling asleep. Or sometimes playing by himself. Yeah. All the lights in the house off. He's like winding down after working hard.
Tell me about instruments. Were you drawn to playing instruments pretty early?
Not really. They were just around, so it didn't seem like, I don't need to pursue that. I was more into drawing, and then as a teenager, I was really into making movies, and that was my plan for life, was to make movies, make animation, like claymation specifically. But then it just sort of switched to music. Let's see, I played tuba starting in 6th grade.
Tuba?
In the school band, yeah. Yeah, like middle school. I picked tuba because I thought it was funny.
It is funny.
Yeah, it is funny. Quickly, the novelty of it wore off. It stopped being funny. Like 3 years in, I'm just like carrying this tuba around. So I wanted to switch to drums. I loved playing drums. Whenever I was somewhere with a drum set, it was like the funnest thing to me. So yeah, eventually I got a drum set, or a neighbor lent me a drum set, and I started a band with my friends.
We're going to talk about this a little bit later, but you released an album in 2020 called Microphones in 2020, which is essentially a one-song, album-length song, which is autobiographical. And I bring this up because of course, we're talking about your life, and this song is about what seems to be very visual recollections, these sort of windows or scenes in your life. And what I notice, especially when you talk about your childhood, was the natural world around you, fog or driftwood, wet clothes, rain, salt, smoke.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me about that world that you grew up around, the natural world.
Yeah, I know that I do write like that. I know that's how I talk and write and express myself. And sometimes it gets pointed out to me
Yeah.
that there's this emphasis. But truly, I'm not trying to overdo it with this naturey, natural world stuff at all. In fact, if anything, I'm self-aware enough about it now that I'm trying the opposite. I'm trying to restrain myself. But maybe it's just that's sort of like the starting point for me. That's the base level of what like normal world seems like, maybe because of my upbringing.
Yeah.
That's sort of what that song Microphones in 2020 was trying to get at, was what is this base level that formed me? And is it all personal for everyone? Does everyone have their own ingredients that they're starting from? Some probably, yeah, their own fingerprint of identity. That world was, my parents were young when they had me. And so they were just kind of winging it and camping a lot and living in a sort of a simple house on a lake and working hard and clearing land. They bought some cheap property nearby and started clearing it and developing it and, building the house they live in now. So, yeah, there were always like burn piles and nettles and forest. I played in the forest with the neighbor friends.
When did you first pick up a guitar?
Well, I played my dad's guitar all the time, just as a kid. But I think probably when I was 13 or 14 is when I actually intentionally picked up a guitar and probably learned a Nirvana song. That's
Come
a
as you are,
pretty,
yeah.
universal first
Yeah.
song.
When you were, I think that album came out, Nevermind came out when you were, I think 13 or 14.
Yeah, 13.
There's actually, and I don't know if this is actually you, but there's a YouTube clip that purports to be you being interviewed.
Yeah, that's me.
Outside of you of a Nirvana concert. It's amazing. You're 14, and you're being interviewed by like someone from MTV News about going to see them. Tell me about Nirvana. How did that record? I mean, I remember when that record came out for sure. What was it about that record that spoke to you? I mean, here you were a kid. You were listening to a lot of the music that your parents were playing. Rolling Stones.
Actually, by then, I had developed my own musical identity, and it was not what my parents were playing. I was buying singles from Payless Drugs, like Color Me Bad and Technotronic, and, the Snap.
Yeah.
The pop music, not pop exactly. I don't know, dance, whatever it was.
Yeah.
I had my songs I like. Oh, MC Hammer was my first concert I went to. Vanilla Ice.
Wow.
The usual stuff. And then it was a pretty abrupt pivot. That was the shift when Nirvana came out. Was I lived rurally, and so I got this rock station from Seattle, or maybe the Bellingham station, where I was listening to this music in my room, and then Smells Like Teen Spirit was on it, and it just was like, it was popular enough to make it on those stations and break through to me out in the woods, but it felt different. I don't know. In hindsight, I sort of view it as more superficial. It wasn't like a deep metaphysical shift or anything. It was more about like the clothes these guys were wearing, and they had this identity of punks, and I didn't know what punk was.
Yeah.
In my mind, I think I had seen a picture of like Sex Pistols, and they just seemed scary and bad and dangerous. Or actually, maybe I watched a part of the movie Sid and Nancy, and so I just thought of punks as like drug people who are like cutting themselves with broken glass. Not appealing to me.
It's interesting because everything I read about you seems to suggest that you had this very strong connection with your parents and that you weren't like kind of a sort of a rebellious, in quotes, teen. And that song, I remember when I first heard that song and I didn't know that they were singing Here We Are Now, Entertain Us. I thought it was Here We Are Now, Entertainers. That's what I thought they were singing when I first heard it. But entertain us and entertainers have very different meanings. And there's a part of that entertain us that really is an incredibly powerful image. Given that you weren't kind of the stereotypically rebellious kid, did that part of Nirvana appeal to you, or was it something just more visceral?
Yeah, I think it was, timing was just right. I was 13, 14. I think it's like a natural urge in an adolescent's life. They need to differentiate themselves from their parents and push against in their way. So that's why that happens. It's perfect timing for me. But it's true. I wasn't like a juvenile delinquent or anything. I was always I tried to be nice enough to my parents.
You were in Washington State, sort of on the cusp of something really big. I mean, within a very short period of time, Seattle would, for better or worse, become like the center of youth culture in the United States, right, for a period of time. And here you were, a kid in this place that had Sub Pop, K Records, and other...
Where I lived, though, Anacortes felt really far from Seattle. It didn't feel like it was something happening where I lived. It felt like Seattle was as far away as I knew about. We would go to Seattle and it would feel exotic.
Yeah.
So I do remember going down there and going to the Sub Pop Mega Mart store and just being like starstruck at just being at the place. So it didn't feel like mine. The way that it did feel like part of my place in my culture was that Nirvana wore torn up plaid.
Yeah.
They wore like gross clothes. And that looked like the people that I saw around me in my life, like the young men who were working with my dad.
I guess while you were in high school and you were making music, you started your first band, I think, in middle school.
Yeah, early high school. Yeah, I was the drummer in this band with my friends.
And you connected with somebody from a band that you really admired. The band was called Beat Happening. Mm-hmm. This guy was Brett Lunsford. You kind of sought him out to hang out with him, work with him. Tell me about how that happened.
Well, yeah, it was sort of like a continuum, I think, being the tween or early teen out in the woods, listening to the pop songs that would come in through the radio, hearing Nirvana, being like, oh, this thing that feels closer to my real life is widely popular, and then following the thread back from that just incrementally to more localized and more kind of obscure things culturally. So it was just a few steps from hearing Nirvana on the radio, seeing them on Saturday Night Live, seeing like Pearl Jam on Saturday Night Live, seeing Eddie Vedder wear a Sub Pop shirt on Saturday Night Live, seeing that same shirt in the window of a store in Anacortes, being like, what? There's a place in my town that knows about this thing that feels like it's my obscure thing I like, and going into that store, and it was The Business, Brett Lunsford's record store, the only, record store in Anacortes, and discovering like, oh, this guy is in this band that we know about, that we've seen on compilations from K Records and Olympia. Just sort of when you're young and passionate about something, it's like following clues and being voracious about absorbing this new thing that, especially in a pre-internet time, just felt like a thrilling treasure hunt and identity building at the same time.
When you were listening to Nirvana or Pearl Jam or Soundgarden, whoever it was, how would you describe the style of music that you were singing and recording? Because you started to record music, I think, when you were 17. How would you describe the kind of sound that you were making? Were you trying to emulate some of that music that you were hearing?
Well, the first music I was making, I was just the drummer and lyric writer in sort of a funny punk band that didn't feel like totally mine. It was more of a fun thing that my friends and I did. So I kind of think of my own music making as starting when I started doing my own recording experiments by myself. And I was trying to emulate Sonic Youth a lot, and also Sonic Youth's friends. It's like Sonic Youth was a good thing to like because they were good at pointing their fans at the more obscure music that they came from, like Glenn Branca and Karl-Heinz Stockhausen. Like, to be a teenager in this small town and be listening to this stuff only because of this cool band Sonic Youth told me to, it made me start being like, oh, okay, music can be this. It can just be pure noise or sound experiment. It can be truly formless in an interesting way.
You'd mentioned that, and I know that you had this like dream of making films, and you do make films now, but that was what you thought you might pursue. And I know you spent some time at college at Evergreen State College, but I guess it was like while you were there that you kind of decided that what you really wanted to do was to make music and to perform music. What do you remember about coming to that realization?
There was not a moment of realization. It was more just moving to Olympia, moving into a bigger pool of people that were pursuing creativity in all forms as their life, and not necessarily making money from it, but surviving on it somehow in this kind of utopian college town, pre-internet scene where we were just living cheaply and there were resources and time. It was sort of, instead of a moment of realization, it was more like a recognition that, oh, I am doing this. This is happening. And I did go to Evergreen for 2 quarters, but it just started to feel quickly like a hassle.
Yeah.
Like a thing that I was doing only as an excuse to be in Olympia. Because my real life that I was having in Olympia was downtown with my friends and recording at the studio that I had access to. I was touring already. It was just sort of happening all on its own.
When you started to record music with friends, because I mean, it's like you can apply this sort of thought experiment to any profession, to sports or to what I did, journalism. At the beginning, you don't really know what's good or bad. I mean, you're just making stuff. And there's almost a lack of inhibition, I think, that happens early in your career. Do you remember feeling like what you were producing was maybe not good or really good or not good enough? Like, what do you remember about that process of just playing music with friends?
I probably have always thought that it's just straight up not good, but that it feels necessary and right and good to me to do it. I don't think I've ever made anything and felt like, oh, hell yeah, this is going to change the world. Everyone needs to hear this. It's always a little bit like, as good as I can get it for now. I think that's important for me. Maybe it's just me, but that's like part of my creative process is the freedom of knowing that it's like not going to be perfect, and that in fact it's probably the imperfections that makes it more interesting, and just to do it and to like stay in it and stay pursuing the idea without that fear of messing up or doing it bad. Also tricking myself that no one is ever going to hear this thing.
Yeah.
That's sort of the mode I have to be in when I'm making stuff. It's like totally inward looking.
I mean, if you're making music and you're not sure or you don't think it's particularly good, how did you feel about performing that music? Because I've seen early videos of you performing when you were just like 17 or 18 years, maybe 19 years old. Like, in living rooms for people. Did you feel comfortable doing that, even though you yourself didn't feel like what you were making was that good?
Yeah, weirdly, I did feel comfortable doing that. I don't know what's up with that. But that it's always been that way where it's possible for me to sort of go into a mode, close my eyes and just do the thing. And I think there's a little bit of a self-delusion going on there about, like I was saying, like pretending that no one is actually hearing this. It's something I can do without getting too in my head about it. But it's true. I don't like when I see a video of myself performing live or hear a recording, it's uncomfortable. I don't like being made aware that that's me out in the world.
When you started to record music and then release it, there was going to be a possibility that you would become more of a public person, that people would hear your music in far off places and want to know more about you or know you or see you perform. And then you would potentially become that person. You become a public person. But you strike me as somebody who really doesn't have a desire to be that person. Was that ever sort of something that you kind of grappled with as you were beginning your professional career?
Well, I don't remember when I established my understanding about this type of stuff. Maybe it's just instinctual, but I think I've recognized that the sort of delusions that happen around public people, like we think we know them, but actually, that's not really Lady Gaga. That's, she's got like a person who she is at home.
Yeah.
And everyone is like that. So that disconnect has always seemed pretty obvious to me. And so maybe my instinct to counteract that is just to try and be as genuine as I can with everyone at all times, and to, in my whatever small ways I can, to chip away at those barriers or like the illusion, the opportunities for people to create illusions. I really like selling my own merchandise at shows on tour, for example. Not because like I like to let people like give me lots of compliments. That part's strange, but more just because I want to be like, hello, yes, here I am. Like my feet are on the ground here. I've got cash in my hand. I'm a person, like this is my job. And thank you. Like that hand-to-hand exchange, I think, is a good way to do away with all of the mysticism that can kind of grow up.
We're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, one of Phil's records gets national attention, and a tragedy leaves him questioning the purpose of songwriting. Stay with us. I'm Guy Raz, and you're listening to The Great Creators. Hey, welcome back to The Great Creators. I'm Guy Raz. So in 1999, Phil Elverum released his first full-length album on K Records as The Microphones. He slowly started to build a devoted following in Washington. And in 2001, he started to get attention from critics. There's too much to talk about your life that we can fit into this whole episode, but I want to talk about The Glow Part 2 that came out in 2001. I think it was released on September 11th, 2001. When that record came out, it received an incredible review from Pitchfork. Pitchfork wasn't yet what it would become a few years later, but it was still already quite influential. And they named it their Record of the Year. I mean, you were, so young. This could have just been this obscure thing, but it was hailed by critics. I mean, it was really called a masterpiece. All these things. Like, first of all, before we talk about the composition of that record and making it, what did you think about the response to it?
I think I was pretty in my own world about it. I lived in this like hippie college town, and I didn't know what Pitchfork was, and I didn't go on the internet or read reviews of my own stuff. I'm not because I didn't want to, but because I just didn't have access to them. I don't know. I just was sort of like, my head was elsewhere.
Yeah.
My head was in like making stuff and going on tour, and doing stuff with my friends. But I do remember people sort of talking to me about it. Like, oh, congratulations, man. On what? I don't know. What's Pitchfork? And then also people ask, also, oh, that must have changed everything for you. But the truth is it didn't.
Yeah.
It didn't really. I recognize now in hindsight that it sort of put that album on a pedestal. It gave it this stamp of like classicness or, significance, to the point where it's people's favorite album now, and I keep repressing it, which is great. But if I'm honest, it's also a little bit annoying how it can. I want to say this without sounding like ungrateful, but it makes it clear that critical response can be arbitrary.
Yeah.
And people's perception of the quality of art of any kind is also arbitrary. And so much of history and what we think of as like iconic and classic is almost just accidental. Like one person says one thing one day, and next thing we know, we've got this canonical works. I'm grateful for the attention around it. And I do think it is I'm proud of that album. I think it's good. And also, over the course of the decades since it's happened, I am also proud of the other stuff I've made.
I'm struck by, and obviously the creative process changes over time, but there are elements of what you've done throughout your career that are similar. They've evolved and they've changed. But to me, and this is my perspective, and I'm curious to get your take on it, I notice this kind of observational writing. I was not surprised to read that you are a fan of Karl Ove Knausgaard, the Norwegian novelist who basically is an observational writer who is a beautiful writer, because I find elements of your writing that remind me of his work, or that, you are, a fan of Gary Snyder, his poetry. What strikes me about, for example, the song The Glow Part 2, there's so many things about that song that strike me, but it starts out with this thrashing guitar. It's a completely different song. And you hear it for about 40 seconds. It's this thrashing guitar. And it just completely switches and becomes this tender, observational song about this kind of internal dialogue. Tell me about what you remember about crafting that song.
It was written on acoustic guitar. I remember writing it. It would have been like November 2000. I was on tour with my friend Mira, and we were staying at her parents' house in Ballackinwood, Pennsylvania. And waking up in the morning, and the guitar was in my room, and just those chords, playing them, and it just came out really quick. And the song before it, I Want Wind to Blow, they sort of go together. And that's why it starts on the album, it starts with the crashing thing, is because it grows out of the end of the song before it, I Want Wind to Blow, where it's like, I forgot how to play it. Na 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 na, and then na na na. I wanted it to flow together in a production way. I don't know, that because my life was in the studio. Songwriting and like studio building of songs was just intermeshed. It was the same thing. So yeah, I wrote it on acoustic guitar and didn't have the production ideas planned out. It existed on that tour. I started playing it that same day, probably. It just existed as a 3-chord guitar song. And then when I got home and recorded it at Dub Narcotic Studio, it became like electric guitar in the beginning, then organ, and then this like the electric guitar outro. But the words and the ideas, to answer your like observational writing question, it's interesting you say that, because I usually think of that there being a shift in my songwriting in like 2016 towards that observational thing. I don't usually think as the earlier work of having that, but maybe it does. I took my shirt off in the yard.
I took my shirt off in the yard. No one saw that the skin on my shoulders was golden.
Yeah, that's pretty pedestrian. I feel like if I were to write that right now, it would say like I took my shirt off in the yard on 7th Avenue at 8:45 a.m.
Yeah.
And then I went and got a bagel, and it would be more autobiographical, overtly.
How do you capture that? Are you always writing things down?
No. But yes, back then I was just always in that creative mode. These days, I don't always have my notebook in my pocket.
Yeah.
I try to, but no, it's not a constant thing these days.
I do think that there's a through line. I do think that and the observational writing, I think, is probably sharpened, right, over the last several years. But there's no question, spending a lot of time with your lyrics, that there is a strong element of that. You know, there's something very visual about the way you write, and I'm curious about how you think about lyrics and music and what works, because sometimes I hear your songs and, you know, the lyrics are so beautiful and the music is so beautiful, but it's hard for me to figure out how you connected the two. I mean, when you hear it, they make sense. But I wonder how you start to think about structuring songs. Like, where do you begin?
Do you mean how the lyrics hang on the chords? How they intermesh or whatever?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know how they do. I think it's, unfortunately, the only answer I can give is just that it's like an intuitive thing, just what feels right to me. And I recognize that, you know, there's not like a solid rhyme scheme. I tend to avoid obvious, like rhythmic repetitions. At least in the really early stuff, there was more of that a little bit. But I think maybe drums are my first instrument. Maybe it has something to do with like a way of thinking rhythmically about these words. Because especially thinking about this last long song I made, Microphones in 2020, it's long and there's tons of words, and a lot of them just seem kind of like I'm barely singing. I'm just sort of like saying this stuff. But the truth is that it's all on a rigid rhythmic structure.
Yeah.
Like certain words need to fall on certain beats in my mind, and that's how it was written. It's maybe, I don't know, hip-hop-esque in that way.
I want to ask you about Crow Looked at Me, which is a record you wrote after the death of your wife, Genevieve, and much has been written about it. There have been many great reviews on that record, and the story of that record has been talked about, and anybody listening can go read about it. But I want to ask you about that record and how it kind of came about. Did those songs and those words just kind of flow to your head? What do you remember about writing that record? Because it obviously was about grief.
Yeah. Well, when I said before about how I usually think of there being a shift in my writing in 2016 towards a more observational thing, that's when it was. It was we had a baby. She got diagnosed with cancer like right after, and lived for a year and then died. And during that time, it just sort of, pulled the rug out from under everything. And it made me think, oh man, all of this obsession that I've had with writing song, like whatever my life has been, it all seems so absurd. And I'm obviously done with music. Obviously, nothing was certain anymore. All of the things that seemed so important to me. And the idea of writing a song about, I had made all these albums asking big questions about life, like what's it mean that we're mortal? What is wild? What is not wild? What's it mean to be a human? and and then this person who I love was just sort of killed basically by this random disease. So, and there is no explanation. It just seemed like all of my big existential grasping in hindsight, it felt so, I don't know what the word is. Not feeble, but just sort of like rude or something, embarrassing. I don't know. Just out of place. Like I didn't know what I was talking about. I was dabbling in concepts that were not for me. And I didn't know how I could ever possibly make something as frivolous as a song again. So, and then I was reading those Knausgaard books, and I heard the album Benji by Kill Moon, which is sort of a musical. I think there's a relation there, like the way that those lyrics are written, just like not trying for poetry, just saying like, here's what happened, here's this person, barely singing it. There's probably lots of music that would fit this description, but that's what hit me. It made me sort of realize like, oh, it's possible to not aspire to big, huge statements and somehow strike deeply anyways, if that makes sense. I think maybe the first song that came out was, I just was playing When I Take Out the Garbage at Night. And that seemed like, that's not trying for poetry. That's okay to do. And from there, more songs, more ideas. I was able to like use this form of song. It was almost habitual to me to sort of get this stuff off my chest for myself only. But yeah.
And for yourself, but also, I mean, you've seen the reaction to that record from people who have also experienced grief, who have talked about how important it is to them. You know, it's remarkable. There's a line on that, in a song on that record. I can't remember exactly which song, and for some reason it struck me so powerfully. And it's not about specifically about what happened. It's something like, you know, you're describing being with your daughter Agathe, who was, you know, a year and a half when Genevieve died, and something like, I saw these geese, and I couldn't remember whether you actually liked geese or not, and but it was your job to always remember things and to remind me of what I remembered, and it was just because there's a subtlety about that. It had nothing to do with geese or whether it was just like I wasn't sure, and I love the subtlety of that of that kind of
that domestic detail.
Yeah.
Well, thanks. That's true. It's kind of crazy now. Like I remember writing that song and singing about foxgloves and the Canada geese and going to the island where someday we would build a house.
Yeah.
And I'm in that house right now. Like it happened. And I'm looking out the window right now at the ground where those foxgloves were growing, and at the chair that I sat pointed at the sunset. That's I don't know why I'm saying this. Just it's I don't think about that. I don't play those songs anymore or listen to them because why would I? But to live in the aftermath of it still and watch it, you know, the chair is almost completely rotted away. It's upside down and it's like got moss growing on it. And that's sort of the point.
We're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, Phil breaks down his most recent 40-minute song, Microphones in 2020. Stay with us. You're listening to The Great Creators. Hey, welcome back to The Great Creators. I'm Guy Raz. Here's more from my conversation with Phil Elverum about his most recent musical project. On that song, an album, Microphones in 2020, it starts, I think the first 7.5 minutes is instrumental, right?
That's true, yeah.
And 7.5 minutes, you begin to tell your story. I want to talk about that first 7.5 minutes. Can you walk me through how you thought about putting those sounds together and how you kind of architected that song over the course of, I think, 44 minutes to tell your life story?
Sure. Well, it's 2 chords, F sharp minor and D something. And they're almost the same chord. I just was playing those 2 chords since early 2019. I was just playing those chords and I loved playing them, switching back and forth with this dun dun da da dun 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 rhythm and sort of playing them. I wasn't writing songs. I was sort of a little bit stumped about what to say or who I was as a person, but I loved playing these chords just for an hour in the evening after had gone to bed. So I was hypnotizing myself with these things and I just loved it. And I wondered, can I get away with releasing an album of this, of this hypnotic pulse? And I love Stereolab and early Stereolab. They're like long drones, and I love hypnotic music, new age music that does these sort of mental tricks a lot. Oh, and then also, the reason why the song starts with 7.5 minutes of this really, this gauntlet of boringness that you have to get through, which I say that sarcastically because I think it's beautiful and cool. I view everything I make sort of as a continuation of the thing that came before it. It's all these albums are sort of like in a sequence.
Yeah.
Just because my life is in a sequence. So I needed a way to sort of transition out of the thing that came before it, which was Lost Wisdom Part 2, of kind of a very different exploration of love and heartbreak. And I wanted to sing about something else, so I needed a big, huge transition to like sever anyone's memory of what came before, mostly my own self.
Yeah.
Sever the umbilical cord. And I knew I wanted it to be those 2 chords, doing that one rhythm on the same grid of pulse for as long as endurable as a listener, let alone as a player. And I knew I couldn't record it on tape because normally I record on this reel-to-reel 8-track, but those reels only hold 32 minutes or so. So I didn't know how long I wanted this thing to be, but I didn't want there to be a limit. So I recorded it on the computer. I made a click track, which is also rare for me. I recorded to like a grid rhythm, just this thumping dun, dun, of the thump. And then I did a lot of scratch record. Yeah, it was very constructed. It was built up. I wrote the lyrics on a very long scroll of paper with pencil and then cut out sections and was moving pieces of paper around and taping them. Sort of the way, I don't know if novelists work this way, but like moving literature around, moving sections in an article around. That's how it felt. It felt like storyboarding or something. Because I was telling this long this long arching narrative.
How do you think about your voice? I mean, because to me, your voice is a little bit like, it's like another instrument, right? It's like when you hear Jose Gonzalez or Tom York or Elizabeth Fraser or Bjork, their voices are instruments.
Hmm.
How do you think about adding your voice as another instrument?
I don't usually think of my voice as an instrument. I don't belong in the same sentence with those people you just said. I don't think. But yeah, usually I think of my singing more as the lyrics laying on top of this other music, not as an instrument woven in. And especially in the song Microphones in 2020, it's the narrator, the audiobook narrator with the background music. But I tried to, in this song, I tried to find as many melodic alternatives as I possibly could over the top of these same two chords. Because for 45 minutes, if I was singing the same melody over and over, that would be torture for everyone. So I think in the song, it goes lots of different places. I can't really summon a section from it. I can only really play it if I start at the beginning and do the whole thing. So yeah, but it starts with the true state of all things. I keep on not dying, the sun keeps on rising. I remember my life as if it's just some dreams that I don't trust, burning off, layered thick, a cargo that I haul, wounds and loves unresolved. I wake up with the sun in my eyes. Yeah. There's a third chord in there sometimes.
Do you consciously write in a visual way? Because there's something it's so visual what you do. I mean, and there's you produce a film for that song where it's just photographs being dropped right in front of you, photographs from your life, just old photographs, and it's beautiful. But you can listen to that song and essentially see a version of that through the music and the words. Is that a conscious process for you?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's just the way it's always been for me. Those photos have been. I used to have them pinned on the wall of my room in Olympia when I was, making the Glow Part 2. A lot of those same photos, I think, and I held the image in my head even as I was, down the street at the studio. I think it's always been kind of a audio-visual project. Maybe that comes from wanting to make movies, which I think of as the merging of those, audio and visual and storytelling in one art form.
I feel like so much of what you write is connected to where you are and what you see around you. And I know that, understandably, you're, sort of concerned about this focus on the natural world that you draw from. But I do feel like where you are is connected to how you sound and what you write and how you express what's inside of you. And I don't know, is that wrong? Is it totally off base?
No, that's true. That's definitely true. It's something that I need to really meditate on that one, because it's true. I'm not annoyed or anything about it, but I have some questions about why it is that I do that. I need to be able to express it more clearly. But definitely, it's a value of mine. And maybe it also is, I'm not that interested in writing about the vast universe of human drama out there. There's a lot of it. And there's a lot of music and art about it. And that's great. There's plenty. But I feel like there's something, to me, more interesting about something beyond this human experience, not just animal experience, but like something that's about the interplay of like living things, the land itself, the place, the cities we built up. The big picture is more interesting to me. And I think talking about places and the way that places feel a certain way and inspire certain like ways of life, that's the big picture.
Tell me about the discipline of your craft. You mentioned novelists, right, who move words around. I mean, do you sit down every day and write words and music? And do you have a particular way that you do it?
I don't sit down every day. I don't have a craft these days. But when I am grabbed by an idea, when I'm in like making music mode, yeah, definitely. I don't think I'm a good example of a person who has a healthy balance of creativity in their life. I think it's like feast or famine for me. When I'm grabbed by an idea and I'm like wrapped up in it, I forget to eat and I almost miss picking my daughter up at school. And, I get wrapped up by it. And I don't mean that in a cool romantic way. Like, look how devoted I am to this creative pursuit. It's more just like my existence as a human being gets pushed to the side and I'm just like in this idea, which is great. It feels great. But it's not an everyday thing because most of the time I'm, doing laundry and I also release my own records. So that's a big part of the job.
And you look after a child.
Not creative.
You're a full-time parent.
And I look after a child. Yeah. Yeah.
When was the last time that happened where you were enveloped by an idea? It just took over.
Microphones in 2020. Yeah, and this is a long gap. Since I was a teenager, there hasn't been this long of a gap where I've been not recording, not making something. Although I have been making a lot of books.
Yeah.
And built a house. So.
Yeah, I think that your description of your relationship with the creative process is not abnormal. Actually, I think that creativity is not consistent. I think it comes and goes, right? It's connected to something ephemeral and abstract and hard to describe. I mean, it's not something you can force, but where if you think about when it happens and when it strikes, what is going on for you? Is it something external? Is it a conversation? Is it being somewhere? Is it looking at something?
Well, I think I've always held this idea that, yeah, you have to just wait around for inspiration, or you can do little things to sort of cultivate fertile territory for inspiration to naturally arise, and then grab it and follow it. But I'm pushing against that. I don't know if I believe that. I think that there's something to novelists, for example, who say just sit down at the desk and write every day.
Yeah.
Like have a routine. I think that can be true in all art forms. And even though I haven't done a great job of establishing that routine for myself, I still dream of it. And so whether it's songwriting or I want to make more paintings. I want to have my painting stuff set up and I want to go to it like a job and I want to sit there even if I'm not feeling this like mystical poetic drive to make some creative thing. I want to sit down and do it and probably make lots of really bad stuff and just, do the work of making it an everyday pursuit.
You mentioned this idea of cultivating creativity, and something that you might admire about novelists is they just sit in a chair and write. Something they also do is they can embody a character, right? They can become a character. Like I think of Jeffrey Eugenides and many of the books he's written, or Gary Snyder and the poetry. So much of what you write, or maybe all of what you write, is really personal. It is coming from your experience or your observations. Do you ever imagine writing from someone else's perspective?
No. I I haven't gotten there yet. I think I recognize the magic of that, but it's pretty far from my natural inclination. I've really hung up on I don't know, some idea of authenticity for me,
Yeah.
and speaking about what I know, and I'm just sort of the type of guy who's wrapped up in his own head about. Obviously, I just made like a 45-minute album about my childhood, so like the truth is, though, I don't want to do that again. I do want to look outward, not necessarily writing fictionally about made up characters or about other people, but more just, I don't want to look at my own belly button next.
There have been, I know you say you don't read the things that people write about you, what they think is smart. Not because I've seen bad things written about you. I just think it's smart for most people to not read about themselves.
It's disorienting.
Yeah. So I've read a lot about where people and kind of fans and critics see you, your place in sort of the, let's say the pantheon of independent music over the last 20 years. Where do you see yourself in that space?
I don't think I have a good perception of whatever my like larger significance might be, because I'm like studiously avoiding an awareness of that. It's I think that I want to keep doing this for the rest of my life. I want to keep making art and music and pursuing these kind of ephemeral things that I think maybe to me at least, it's like the meaning of life is pushing a little bit farther beyond our existences to like explore and express this ephemeral stuff. So my point is that I can only do that if I can create sort of an insulation around me from an awareness of this like outside world of any idea of significance. I need to just hone into the idea, because it's the type of thing that I'm making is not really about the exchange between the listener and the performer. Lots of art and music is that. It's about the conversation. But I think for me, it's not so much. It's more meditative or something.
When you think about what's next, you're a dad, you've got a first grader at home, and as you've talked about, you've got to make 3 meals a day and do laundry, and there's a routine to being a parent, which I love, and as a parent, and have found really actually incredibly grounding in a lot of ways, in every way. But creative spark is going to strike. It's going to happen again, and you may not know when or from where, but it's going to happen. And I wonder whether you can sort of feel it coming. Is there a moment where that you start to feel this onset of that spark?
I think at this point, I am okay at doing it on purpose. I think that I can decide. That's how microphones in 2020 went. I like had this idea. I played these chords for a while, and I'm like, okay, it's time. I'm going to write this thing. And I sat down and got to work with it, novelist style. And that's how I think it's going to happen next. It hasn't been happening because I moved into this house that's like kind of under construction still, and I don't have a workspace set up. But I think once I get the like towel rod hung and all the little details, and I'm going to set up a good workspace, and then I'm going to get to work on. I definitely have these ideas that are in my head ready to pursue. Yesterday, I was working outside, clearing some brush, and then I was like lying down on a rock, resting, and then I got an idea for a song that I'm probably not going to record because I don't. It's going to go away. It's one of the many ideas that pops up that will just not be grabbed. But I heard the whole thing in my head. It started with my voice going hum, and then that hum built into this organ chord, and I just wanted that to, like it's hard to describe, but I had the whole idea, and I knew where it would go from there, like how the rhythm would drop in. I have to just trust that ideas like that will pop back up.
That's Phil Elverum of the Microphones in Mount Eerie. Phil recently released a book of his late wife Genevieve's poetry. We'll link to it on our website at thegreatcreators.com/Elverum. And as always, you can find all our episodes and show notes at thegreatcreators.com. Hey, thanks so much for listening to our show this week. Please make sure to hit follow in your podcast app so you never miss a new episode. And as always, it's entirely free. This episode was produced by Nat Hoops and edited by Jeff Rogers. Thanks also to Elaine Coates, Kevin Leahy, Kayla Rosenbaum, and Daniel Shukin. I'm Guy Raz, and you've been listening to The Great Creators from Built It Productions.